Do Christians have to obey the Old Testament laws? After all, Jesus said in Matthew 5:17, "Do not think that I've come to do away with the law of Moses." And then he said, "Whoever disobeys even the least important of the commandments will be least in the kingdom of heaven." So what role do these laws play in our lives today? There's 613 of them in total, mainly in Leviticus and Exodus and Deuteronomy. All sorts of laws covering all aspects of religious ceremonies, the ordering of society and personal spirituality. Should we obey them or not? Here's what's coming up. Firstly, we're going to think about the purpose of these laws. Secondly, we're going to think about what Paul said about them in his letter to the Galatians. And thirdly, we're going to think about what role they play in our faith today. So what was the purpose of the Old Testament law? The answer is quite simple. The purpose of the law was to set the people of Israel apart from all the other nations of the world. They were God's chosen people, and so they had to live differently from others. And it's really important to remember that the people of Israel never thought that they would be saved by keeping the law. They didn't keep the law in order to win God's approval. Instead, they knew that they had been chosen and saved by the undeserved grace and mercy of God, and then they kept the law as an act of thanksgiving for that. And there are three different types of law in the Old Testament. Firstly, there's moral law. And this is the type of law that explains how human beings should live in relationship with each other and with God. For example, the 10 Commandments in Exodus 20 are moral law. Secondly, there's civil law, which are all those laws that taught the people of Israel how to structure society. For example, Deuteronomy 24 verses 10 to 11. "When you make your neighbor a loan of any kind, you shall not go into the house to take the pledge. You shall wait outside while the person to whom you're making the loan brings the pledge out to you." Now, there are loads of civil laws designed to create a humane and just society, eradicating injustice, providing compensation for victims, preserving personal and property rights, and creating room for both justice and mercy. And then thirdly, there's ceremonial law, which taught the people of Israel how to do worship properly. For example, Leviticus 1 verse 3. "If the offering is a burnt offering from the herd, you shall offer a male without blemish. You shall bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting for acceptance in your behalf before the Lord." And these ceremonial laws governed the priests and their garments, sacred times and feasts, offerings and sacrifices, dietary laws and purity laws, and so on. So three types of law: moral, civil, and ceremonial, to structure the society of the people of Israel so that they could be holy and set apart for God. And all of that was under the old covenant with God. But as Christians, we don't live under the old covenant. We live under the new covenant, which was sealed by the body and blood of Christ when he died on the cross. So here's the thing. As Christians, we don't need to obey any of the Old Testament laws. They have no authority over us whatsoever. So why do we, in reality, keep some and not others? Why do we try to keep the moral laws, the 10 Commandments and so on, but we don't try to keep the ceremonial laws, rules about the offering of sacrificial pigeons in worship and so on? Why do we seem to pick and choose? Well, that's where Paul's letter to the Galatians can help us. When Paul wrote his letter to the Galatians, there was a big debate going on in the church there. There were Jews who'd become Christians, and there were Gentiles who'd become Christians. And the Jewish Christians were saying that for the Gentile Christians to be proper Christians, they had to obey the Old Testament laws. They had to be circumcised, not eat pork, observe the Jewish festivals and so on. But the Gentile Christians were saying, no, we don't need to do any of that. That's all part of your Jewish heritage. If you are a Jewish Christian, feel free to obey the laws as part of your cultural heritage. But as Gentiles, we don't need to take all that on for ourselves. So Paul writes them a letter, and he says that under the Old Covenant, the people of God were governed by the law of Moses. But under the New Covenant, we are governed by the law of Christ. And what is the law of Christ? Well, in Galatians 5 verse 14, Paul writes this: "The entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command: love your neighbor as yourself." So the law of Christ is the law of love. As Christians, we are called to love God with all our heart, our mind, our soul, and our strength, and to love our neighbor as we love ourselves. That is the law of Christ. That is the law of love. If we love, we fulfill the requirements of the law. So what does that mean for us today? When you think about the Old Testament laws, they too were built on the principle of love. The ceremonial laws were trying to regulate worship in such a way that love for God was expressed adequately. The moral and civil laws were trying to regulate society in such a way that human relationships were based on mercy and grace, and that the ordering of society was done in such a way as to maintain the purity of the people of God. Ceremonial law, love the Lord your God. Moral and civil law, love your neighbour as yourself. So it's not surprising that there is some overlap between the Old Testament law, the Old Covenant, and the law of Christ, the law of love, which is the New Covenant. And we find ourselves following some of the Old Testament laws, not because we need to obey them in and of themselves, but they happen to be good examples of what love looks like in practice. So for example, Leviticus 19 verse 15 says, "Do not pervert justice, but judge your neighbour fairly." As Christians, we don't follow that principle because we are obeying that Old Testament law. We follow that principle because it's the right and loving way to behave, and it happens to be an Old Testament law as well. Leviticus 19:33 says this, "When a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. They must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself." So when we welcome refugees and displaced people into our country, we're not doing it to obey that law in Leviticus. We're doing it because it's the right and the loving thing to do. And it happens to be a law in Leviticus as well. In Galatians 6 verse 2, Paul says simply this, "Carry one another's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ." It's all about love for God and love for others. The Old Testament laws are examples to us of how love could be worked out by the people of God in their particular cultural context at that particular time. But we are no longer subject to those laws. Instead, we are subject to the law of love. And the question for each one of us is simply this: how can we, in our daily lives, show love towards God and love towards others? How will we live out the law of Christ in our relationships and in our worship?